She was crying in the convenience store parking lot at 2 in the morning when I turned my phone toward her and let the numbers speak for me. Balance $13,214, not zero, just stripped down. Like someone had taken everything solid in my life and locked it behind glass she couldn't reach, couldn't plan around, couldn't lean on. Her mascara had collapsed into dark streaks down her cheeks. "So that's it?" she said, voice breaking. "That's all you have?" "That's all I can touch," I said. "That's the point." She stared at the screen like it was a diagnosis. Then she looked at me with that mix of hurt and disbelief I didn't fully understand yet, and whispered the sentence that always sounds like love until you hear the pressure behind it. "I thought you loved me." "I do," I said. And that's why I needed to know what would happen next. I never saw her again after that night. Not in person. But what followed changed everything I thought I knew about trust, about starting over in Mexico, and about what it means to be an older foreigner with a steady pension and a soft spot you keep pretending doesn't exist. My name's Nolan. I'm 61. I spent 34 years in shipping and logistics, solving other people's problems, until my body started sending warnings I couldn't ignore. I retired early with a pension that pays $3,600 a month and realized something uncomfortable. In the US, that kind of money doesn't buy peace. It just buys survival. So I came to Mexico, not to run, not to chase some fantasy, just to live somewhere a simple life didn't feel like failure. I rented a modest apartment, ate local food, kept my expenses under $2,000, and let the rest sit quietly in the background. That season I landed in Guadalajara, a calm neighborhood near Providencia, walkable streets, predictable days. 2 blocks from my place was an OXXO I didn't need. There was a cheaper tienda right next to my building. But I went anyway, because of Lucía. She worked the morning shift, early 30s. Small, sharp-eyed, hair always pulled back like softness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her face carried the tired strength of someone who'd been responsible for too much, too early. The first time she really spoke to me, I was buying water and gum. She rang me up and said casually, "You're the man from the apartments. You come here a lot." I smiled, tried to flirt. "Better coffee than the place next door." She didn't miss a beat. "Same coffee. Just costs more." Then she laughed. Not polite, real. And that laugh hooked me before I knew what I was stepping into. After that first laugh, routines formed faster than I expected. I started timing my mornings around her shift. A few minutes of small talk turned into longer conversations. Complaints about rude customers. Jokes about the traffic that never seemed to move. Then, slowly, the heavier truths slipped in. Lucía told me her family lived outside Uruapan, that her mother's health wasn't great, that most of her paycheck went straight back home every month, and no matter how carefully she planned, she was always behind. One morning, wiping down the counter without looking at me, she mentioned her younger brother had been accepted into a technical program. "He's smart," she said quietly. "Smarter than me. He could actually do something." Then she added, almost like an afterthought, "But we don't have the fees." I felt the reflex rise immediately, the old instinct that says, "I can fix this." I didn't offer. Not because I couldn't. I could have paid it without noticing. But because the moment felt too familiar. Years earlier in Ohio, my first marriage had cracked the same way. Everything was fine until I talked about slowing down, retiring early, living smaller. That's when I became unambitious. The divorce didn't just cost money, it cost trust. So with Lucía, I stayed careful. I listened more than I spoke. I told myself I was being smart. And for a while, it felt safe. Coffee after her shift became lunch at small fondas, where the plates were chipped and the cooks called everyone mijo. Lunch turned into evening walks through neighborhoods I'd never seen before. She showed me murals, side streets, places tourists never noticed. She translated the city for me. She never asked me for money, not once. But I could feel the math happening behind her eyes. When I mentioned that I moved around sometimes, spending a few months here, a few months somewhere else, she asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. How expensive are flights? How do you just leave like that? Do you work online? I downplayed everything. Fixed income, simple life, nothing fancy. It wasn't a lie, just carefully framed. I always paid when we went out, because it felt ridiculous not to. A nice dinner for two cost less than an appetizer back home. When I covered the bill, she thanked me like I'd done something enormous. That gratitude felt good, maybe too good. One night I met up with a guy I knew, Caleb, former Marine, married to a Mexican woman. Practical, not bitter. We had beers on a rooftop overlooking the city lights, and I mentioned Lucía, trying not to sound hopeful. She seems real, I said. Caleb studied me for a second. Has she asked you for money yet? No. He nodded. That doesn't mean anything. You don't really know someone until the money situation changes? I laughed it off, but the idea stuck. And once it did, I couldn't stop noticing things. The noticing started small. When we went out to eat, Lucía always let me choose the restaurant. But I caught her eyes flicking to the menu prices before she ordered. Not greedy, not careless, just calculating. She never chose the cheapest option, never the most expensive, always the middle. Like she understood exactly what someone like me was comfortable spending. One afternoon I mentioned I'd had an expensive month, medical bills back home, a few unplanned costs. I said it casually, not fishing for sympathy. Her response was immediate warmth. Then we stay in this weekend, she said. We don't need to go out. Thoughtful, reasonable. Except the following week, when I told her everything was fine again, she suggested a newer restaurant she'd been wanting to try. Pricier. Trendier. Like the restriction had been temporary, and now the leash was off. Small things. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The moment that really stuck with me happened at her apartment. Her roommates were out. An old telenovela played softly on her laptop while she rested her head on my shoulder. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and swiped it away. Everything okay? I asked. My cousin, she said quickly. Asking about money again. The phone buzzed a second time, then a third. She muted it, but her shoulders tightened. Finally, she sighed and said, My brother's fees are due next week. We're still short. How short? I asked, already knowing I shouldn't. 7,000 pesos, she said. About $400. I had that in my wallet. Cash, but I didn't offer. Something in me, Caleb's warning, my own history, kept my mouth shut. What are you going to do? I asked. She shrugged. I'll figure it out, I always do. Then she looked at me, not with words, with expectation. The half-second glance that asks a question without speaking it. Aren't you going to help? She looked away fast, like she didn't want to be caught wanting. But I saw it. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I realized it wasn't just about whether she asked for money. It was whether she already counted it as hers. Whether I'd quietly become a plan instead of a partner. The thought settled in and refused to leave. So I decided to change the equation. I told myself I wasn't testing her. I was protecting myself. I asked her to meet me at a cafe a few days later, said I needed to talk about the future. She looked nervous when I said it, like she assumed the worst. I've been thinking long term, I told her, about where I'll be in 20 years. She nodded. Me too. That's when I brought up the annuity, locking away a big portion of my savings to guarantee income later. Security. Stability. When I finally mentioned the amount, 80,000, I watched her face carefully. She listened. And that's when the real test began. I explained the downside slowly, watching her reactions instead of her words. Once the money went into the annuity, I told her I wouldn't be able to touch it for 5 years. No emergency fund, no safety net. Just my pension and careful budgeting. That means, I said, I can't help with your brother's fees all at once, and I can't help you start school right away. I could help in smaller monthly amounts, but it would push everything back a year. The cafe noise faded into the background. She stared at her coffee like the answer might be at the bottom of the cup. Finally, she said, But it's good for you, for your future. Relief hit me harder than I expected. Then she added softly, But what if you didn't put all of it in? Maybe just half. Then you'd still be safe, and I could start sooner. There it was. Not a demand, not anger, just a suggestion that neatly lined up with her urgency and none of my risk. I smiled and told her I'd think about it. But inside, I already knew. The next morning, I told her I'd decided to go forward with the full amount. Papers signed, transfer scheduled. She hugged me and said she was proud of me for thinking long term, but something in her voice felt rehearsed. The shift wasn't dramatic. That's what made it unmistakable. Day 1, her good morning text came hours later. No heart, just words. Day 2, she canceled lunch, extra shift. Day 3, she said she was tired, maybe the weekend. All reasonable explanations. Except her social media kept updating. Coffee with friends, filtered sunsets, quotes about trusting the process. She wasn't too tired for everything. Just for me. By the 4th day, the pattern was clear. The moment my money became unreachable, I did too. That's when I decided to lie. I showed up at the OXXO during her shift. She looked surprised, almost uncomfortable, like I'd stepped into a version of her day I no longer belonged in. I waited until the store was empty and casually pulled out my phone. Funny thing, I said. The annuity transfer got delayed. Some international issue. I still have access to everything for now. I watched her face change instantly. Her shoulders dropped, her eyes brightened. That distant smile softened into something warm and familiar. Oh, thank God, she said. I mean, not that they messed up. Just that you still have access. You know, just in case. Just in case. She touched my arm, asked when it might be fixed, leaned closer when she spoke. By the time I left, we had plans for dinner, her idea. The nicer place she'd mentioned before. That night, she was attentive, laughing, present, wearing the dress I liked. And sitting across from her, watching her talk, I felt a cold clarity settle in. Nothing had changed except her understanding of my access to money. So I planned one final test. The kind you don't recover from. I texted her just before 11 that night. Can you meet me at the OXXO parking lot at 2 a.m.? It's important. She called immediately. What's wrong? I'm okay, I said. I just need to see you. There was a pause long enough to tell me she was thinking, then quietly, okay, I'll be there. At 1:55, I stood under a flickering streetlight watching a stray dog tear into a garbage bag. I wasn't nervous. I felt settled. The kind of calm that comes when you already know the answer. Lucía arrived on her scooter a few minutes later. No makeup, oversized shirt, helmet hair. She looked genuinely worried. What's going on? She asked. You're scaring me. I didn't speak. I opened my banking app and turned the screen toward her. Balance, $13,214. Her breath caught. What happened? The annuity went through, I said. I lied about the delay. I wanted to see what you'd do. Her face hardened. This is a test? Yes. That's insane, she snapped. You lied to me. I gave you a choice, I said calmly. When you thought I couldn't help, you pulled away. When you thought the money was back, you came back too. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Tears gathered, slow and angry. I wasn't using you, she whispered. Maybe you didn't think you were, I said. But when I told you about protecting my future, your first instinct was to ask me to do less, so yours could move faster. That's not fair. And the last few days, I continued. The distance, the cancellations. Then suddenly I mattered again. Her mascara streaked as she cried, I thought you loved me. I did, I said. That's why I had to know. I pulled cash from my pocket and held it out. This is what you were short for your brother. She stared at it, then pushed it back. Keep it. You don't understand what it's like to struggle. You're right, I said, but I know what it's like to be seen as a solution instead of a person. She turned away, then stopped. I was starting to love you, she said. I pulled back because you made a choice that meant another year of waiting. I thought I was your partner, not an experiment. Then she left, and a month later I was back in Puerto Vallarta. Quiet days, clean numbers, no surprises. Then a message came from Caleb, A screenshot. Lucia, new boyfriend, older foreigner, engaged, starting school next semester. Part of me felt justified. Another part wondered if my test created the ending I was trying to avoid. I protected my money. I'm just not sure what else I lost.